Parliament's Ad Hoc Committee probing allegations of criminal infiltration and political interference in the justice system again heard from controversial forensic investigator Paul O'Sullivan. He returned after walking out of proceedings last week, facing tense exchanges with MPs over his role in investigations linked to the police watchdog IPID. His former assistant, Sarah Jane Trent, also gave emotional testimony during questioning. Meanwhile, the Madlanga Commission of Inquiry heard from suspended organised crime unit head, Major General Richard Shibiri. He denied most allegations against him, but admitted receiving and repaying a loan from businessman Vusimuzi Matlala. To unpack what came out of this week's proceedings, we're now joined by crime analyst Chad Thomas. Chad, a very good afternoon to you, and thank you so much for your time. A lot to unpack, but we'll try as much as possible, Chad, to keep it brief. But what stood out for you, firstly, from this week's testimony by Paul O'Sullivan before the Ad Hoc Committee? Of course, we saw another heated exchange. One MP challenged that he may have very well, given his influence in IPID particularly, tried to overthrow the state. Importantly, O'Sullivan apologising to parliamentarians for having walked out previously. Just your take.
A very good afternoon to you and to the viewers, and thank you for the invitation to join the show this afternoon. I think the most important takeaway for me is that this was one of the most important weeks in respect of what came out of both Madlanga as well as Ad Hoc, and that was the question of what we term gratification. We have a very strict piece of legislation in South Africa known as the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act, and it talks to gratification. And what we saw coming out of the Madlanga Commission was that Major General Richard Shibiri admitted to receiving a loan from Vusimuzi Matlala. And what we saw coming out of Ad Hoc was even more interesting. Advocate Mashukha spoke about the fact that monies had been paid across to the then IPID Executive Director, Robert McBride, in respect of fees for his legal battles that he was having. And it later transpired that those monies were paid across by Paul O'Sullivan. So we've now got the gratification of Shibiri where there's a loan, and we've heard expert analysis on loans constituting gratification. We've now heard that Robert McBride had his legal fees paid for by Paul O'Sullivan. And then we heard of a different kind of what could be gratification, and that was the relationship between Sarah Jane Trent and Robert McBride. So all in all, this week has presented to us this examination of the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act, and it's left this lingering question: what actually constitutes gratification? And did all of these three people somehow receive gratification from people that could be termed bad actors?
Yeah, just even from that summary that you've just painted this picture, it is very important. I want to just go back to, in fact, Shibiri's testimony. Outside of obviously having admitted to that loan, he emphasized that, of course, it was paid to his son's bank account, not on his bank account. But what was important about his testimony was also admitting that there is some level of infiltration, within these systems. And that is, I would say, quite a loaded statement, given the fact that, of the role that he also assumes. Of course, he was denying any allegations against him, but it does point to that credibility factor within the criminal justice system.
General Shibiri is currently suspended, but he headed up one of the most important components in the South African Police Service, and that's organised crime. And we're talking about receiving loans from organised crime figures. Now, one can't suddenly come along and say, well, I didn't know. We're talking about people that are held to a very high standard because of the position that they hold within the South African Police Service. How is it that you, as the head of organised crime, don't know about the previous cases involving Vusimuzi Matlala? How is it that you don't know about the current cases that are under investigation? It makes no sense. When he acknowledges to, okay, I received money, it was paid into my son's account, it was to repair a car, it was paid back, he may be admitting that because there is a definitive trail. But what about where there aren't definitive trails? What about the cash in the bags that we've heard so much about? where there isn't a definitive trail and it's very difficult to prove. So perhaps to try and get himself off the hook, he acknowledges to receiving a loan to repair a car went via his son's account because all the evidence points to that. But what about the relationship? What about the crux of the relationship? What does it tell you about the leaders of our police and the leaders of other very important law enforcement agencies that they're taking loans from persons that are not just controversial, but are focuses and persons of interest in organized crime investigations? We've seen it with other police members also holding very senior ranks. We've heard rumors of Brazilian butt lifts. We've heard all kinds of things coming out. And it just makes one wonder that if somebody's chosen to be a police officer, they've chosen a specific lane, they're going to fight crime, whereas criminals have chosen to be outlaws. There shouldn't be the coming together or the merge of these two parties. There should be a structured line between the two.
Former prosecutor Advocate Michael Mashogo suggested that IPID may have allowed these two private individuals, at least, to take on responsibilities that belong to the institution itself. If that's the case, I mean, what risks does that pose then for the credibility of investigations? We also saw, of course, an emotional, former assistant to Paul O'Sullivan, Sarah Jane Trent, who broke down under questioning. Of course, she too has been accused of being at the center of those investigations, together with Paul O'Sullivan when it comes to IPID.
We need to stop referring to Sarah Jane Trent as an assistant. She's a certified fraud examiner and she's an admitted attorney. She gets held to a very high standard. She was also listed as corporate counsel to Paul O'Sullivan and Associates and Forensics for Justice, and she was listed as a director for Forensics for Justice and Paul O'Sullivan and Associates. It's very dismissive that everybody's referring to her as just an assistant because it sounds as if she was under the complete control of Paul O'Sullivan. Let me remind the public, she's admitted attorney and she's a certified fraud examiner. That means she understands the law. She was corporate counsel, which means she had to advise O'Sullivan on what was wrong and what was right. It's very easy for her to dismiss it all now that she was just an assistant and acting under instruction of O'Sullivan. And I don't believe that's the truth. The fact remains is that the advocate Mashogo has brought evidence to say that there was a capture of sorts that took place, and we're now seeing the evidence of this. We're seeing that the complainants, that being O'Sullivan and Trent, in the Paglane matter, drove an investigation. Now, you can't have a complainant-driven an investigation. It has to be prosecutorial guided, and it has to be led by the law enforcement agency appointed. You can't have complainants or whistleblowers driving an investigation, which is exactly what they did. And now we're learning that how would somebody like McBride be able to dismiss somebody like O'Sullivan out of hand if it's O'Sullivan that propped him up and was able to get him back into that position by paying his legal fees? That in itself is a critical aspect that came out this week. And that in itself shows that there was a lot of dovetailing that was occurring that should not have been occurring between the private sector and the public sector investigators.
And I mean, at the time, of course, we know that she was the assistant. We're still questioning, of course, her trajectory within that relationship with Paul O'Sullivan in terms of her promotion too, that was quite accelerated from the time she started off to the time she became a director. We also heard that, as a fact. But I take that point of her seniority and having to know better, and of course not having to hide behind a junior role when she actually assumed a much senior role. We also saw, of course, former, as we've talked about very briefly. Let's go back to Shibiri, in terms of his testimony. Outside, of course, of having admitted that particular loan, but also the associations in terms of the people that the company rather of people that he was keeping. What should the public in the coming days or weeks look out for, particularly of what's coming out of these various commissions in terms of the relationships that senior members of law enforcement hold going forward, while also investigating very serious crimes?
I think the greatest concern, of course, is the socializing aspect. We've heard how General Richard Shibiri had Matlala and Matlala's wife at his son's engagement party at his private residence. We've now heard how Richard Shibiri and others were invited to an event that was held in Northcliffe at a boutique hotel and that there was a lot of strange goings on at that particular function. Again, it takes me to my earlier remarks that there needs to be a line drawn. If you're in law enforcement, you're in law enforcement. If you're in crime, you're in crime. And never should the two dovetail. And we're seeing far too much of this. Why are these people having relationships with people who are persons of interest in very, very serious crimes? Why do you have somebody like Shibiri communicating with somebody like Matlala, who is a instrumental jigsaw piece in the kidnapping of Jerry Bochecha? The same with Richard Shibiri. Richard Shibiri is head of organized crime investigations, which investigates the likes of kidnap for ransom and other very serious types of cases. So this is being a great reckoning. We've now seen that the infiltration has occurred. It's no longer rumor. It's no longer supposition. It's no longer a genuine camouflage standing on his platform. It's fact. These people have acknowledged, these very senior people, to having relationships with people that if they had done their job, and those around them had done the necessary due diligence, they should have had no business associating with people who are involved in organized crime.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Chad, for your time and analysis. Really do appreciate it. Of course, a crime expert there just speaking to us about those various commissions that we saw in the week. Of course, a lot of important testimony too coming out. Thank you so much for that particular discussion.